Good morning, Gustavus. No, I'll just hold it. So I first showed up in Gustavus on May 15th, 1977. I was a grad student at University of Washington, and I'd been hired as a field assistant to dig several hundred soil pits on the outer coast. And Greg Streveler met me at the airport. So I just wanted to point out in this photograph that Judy Brakel is giggling in the background. So one of the main reasons that I keep coming back to Glacier Bay is Greg's mentorship, friendship, and his continual supply of good ideas. So today I wanted to talk about two recent projects. And you'll notice that neither of these are pure physical science. As Greg would say, the goal with a capital G is wisdom, and wisdom is seldom attained through any one discipline or field of knowledge. So the first one is a project that Ben Gagliotti led, and notice that Greg Wiles, who's coming up next, was one of our collaborators. So the title is Ecosystems at Glacier Margins Can Serve as Climate Change Laboratories. So the question that I hope is in most of our minds is how are ecological communities going to respond to this being the uptick in global change, in this case temperature, which has occurred since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So on the x-axis is years AD, and the y-axis is global temperature. So we're into a period of unusual, anomalously quick and radical climate change. And the big question is, well, how's everything going to respond, both natural communities and human communities? So what we did was, our focus is on old-growth forest. This is a old-growth spruce hemlock forest on the distal side of a big Holocene age moraine out on the outer coast. So the question we ask is, how will old-growth forests respond to very rapid climate changes? Well, obviously you can't do an experiment, but we do have a lot of natural experiments, and that's one of the great things about Glacier Bay. So in this case, the La Perouse Glacier, which is named after this dead white guy down here, the glacier's been advancing and retreating, so here's La Perouse Glacier. And here's our study forest up here, so the red area. So the idea was that this glacier is going back and forth really quickly, so we can use that as an analogy for very rapid climate changes, and let's see how the old growth forest responded in terms of its growth. So what we did was using NPS-approved hand tools. We drilled a hell of a lot of holes in a lot of dead cedar snags. And we had an 800-meter transect from the edge of the glacier. We actually had dead stump by the ice up onto the moraine. And what we were curious about was, well, what effect does the glacier have on the microclimate of the forest as it advances and retreats rapidly? So now we just took out the last of the sensors last summer, but here are 3 years of data. And all you need to really notice on this graph, here's time down on the x-axis, and then a temperature difference between the near and farthest recording thermometers on the y-axis. What we found was that when the glacier's nearby, you can cool microclimate down by 8 degrees centigrade. That's huge, right? So it gets really cold near the ice, no brainer. But now the trick was, okay, so let's take this measurement and then look at the glacier's changing position and reconstruct the temperature history that our forest, that little stand of trees up on the moraine, how it's responded to these very rapid changes in climate. So the recent retreat history is pretty well known. We pull most of this information off of aerial photographs and actually old photographs that myself and others have taken because we just keep coming back to this area. But we also have some information, you guessed it, from John Muir, who landed on this beach on the north end of the La Perouse Glacier in 1899. He was with the Harriman expedition. The longboat churned over in the surf. They all got dumped out. He and G.K. Gilbert kind of crawled up on shore. They're totally wet, and it's like, well, G.K., let's go look at some moraines and warm up. So they actually spent like a whole afternoon along the margin of La Perouse Glacier and left some really nice sketch maps and drawings of where the glacier was. So that's 1899, so it's a really good data point. So what we were able to do then is, here's 1800, here's 2000, here's the glacier. So in 1831, it's back here, advances to a maximum about 1895, and then it undergoes this retreat. These are historical observations, so the different colors are different data sources. So now we have the temperature function of how cold it is depending on how far you are from the glacier, right? And then we have where the glacier was relative to our trees. And we're going to put the two things together, and we're going to come up with this temperature history of the study forest. So again, here's AD, 1700, 2000. Here's mean summer temperature on the y-axis. So what we found is that between 1700 and about 1825, climate was pretty darn good. It was fairly stable. As Greg Wiles can tell you, some of these cold periods here were actually caused by volcanic dimming, but that's a question for him. But look what happened as the glacier approached. So after about 1825, glacier's crawling out towards our forest, and the temperature in the forest is going up and down. So it's a time of very unstable, rapid climate change. So what did the trees do? Well, this is based on almost 200 trees, where we take these increment cores. It doesn't hurt the tree. We measure how much wood accreted in every year. So this is a proxy for primary productivity, okay? So the spaghetti in different colors are different species of trees. So here's cedar, western hemlock, mountain hemlock, spruce, and pine. And as you can see, during this period of stable climate, the forest was pretty much responding synchronously to the same kind of slight climate drivers, okay? But then what happened was, as the glacier approached and began to fluctuate, the spaghetti just kind of went wild. So the tree species are all behaving differently. So you get within the kind of the pink shadow here, you see how all the lines are kind of going every which way, right? Here's temperature down here. This is ring width index, so the width of the rings. So what we concluded from this is, out of this diversity of responses, the spaghetti here, remember the different colors are different tree species, comes this relative stability in primary productivity. So remember, our proxy for primary productivity is ring width, okay? So how much wood was put on every year. So during the time of fairly stable climate, primary productivity was kind of up and down, but it basically became more stable when the climate went crazy, which was most unexpected, and the reviewers hated this. So why is maintaining your canopy important if you're a forest? Okay, the reviewers hated this because this is sorting at a level above that of the individual organism, right? We're talking about selection at the community level, which is like, bzz, don't talk about that. Well, we think that what may have gone on over hundreds of thousands of years is that these 5 tree species, which have repeatedly invaded Southeast Alaska after glaciations, have kind of reached an equilibrium where they do well together. They make a nice team, in other words. And in Southeast Alaska and Southern Alaska, there are alternative stable states. And if your canopy breaks down, you could be replaced by an alder haunted hellhole or subforest. Subforest is a term that Ian Worley and Greg Streveler invented during that biological survey on the outer coast. And it's like an open canopy, elfin forest with a lot of shrub understory. So the point is that there are alternatives to an old growth state. So keep your canopy together or you may get replaced. And in fact, alder has dominated some inner fjord situations for centuries, like in Upper Yakutat Bay, and even more strikingly in, college fjords, where Calvin Heuser's pollen works. Alder has occupied the landscape for more than 10,000 years. Okay, so there are alternatives, and you got to be careful you don't let the canopy break down. So in conclusion then, and this is something that Greg would have loved, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So you couldn't predict this kind of response indicated by the red arrow, knowing the physiology of individual species. It's the team together that has created this phenomenon. And that community stability may, in fact, be empowered in some cases by its ecophysiological diversity. So, obviously, many natural experiments exist in Glacier Bay. That's why the scientists keep coming back here. And there's a bunch more. So, the other little project I wanted to talk to you about was something that Greg was really excited about last June. And he was like continually nagging me down here. Crawl out of your disciplinary culvert and integrate. So his question was, he goes, well, what have we learned from Glacier Bay for all these decades about what may have faced the first Americans as they dispersed into lower latitude North America 17,000 years ago? So let's put it together and tell me what we've learned. So a little bit of background. We know from the Russian archaeologists that people have been in the Arctic for a very long time. There are 2 sites in northern Siberia now where we have evidence of people 45,000 years ago and let's say 31 to 34,000 years ago, way up north, way beyond tree line. The significant thing is that both these periods in Earth's history were interstadials. So these are unusually warm times like today. In contrast, on our side of Bering Strait, humanity's presence is very recent. So the earliest widely accepted dates, and Wayne is cringing somewhere in the audience, the oldest dates is Cooper's Ferry down in Idaho. So let's say it's about 16,500, 17,000. So there's this huge time gap. What the heck happened in between? Well, nobody knows, and everybody's welcome to have a new theory. But here's one. We think that perhaps there was a human exodus out of the Arctic during the coldest times. So this would have been the last glacial maximum between 26,000 and about 17,000. So where do you go when it gets cold up north? Well, you head to the coast because that's where the resources are. And this kind of fits. You can make this fit with what's known from the human DNA. So this is work by Willerslev and Meltzer. And we know at this time that we had these ancient northern Siberians somehow being isolated, and these are the people that are going to colonize North America. So it could be under our scenario now that this is when maritime adaptation first occurred. So they're down in the Sakhalin Island area, perhaps northern Japan, and they're going to have, we know from the human genetics that there's admixture with East Asian genetic stock, okay? So we have this big mixture of ANS and East Asian. Well, the next thing that happened is the gate opens to North America. And this is a northwest coast route. And just to remind you of the geography, because Lewis got confused about where he was. We're over here. Here's the Bering Land Bridge. So this is the scene 21,000 years ago. So here's Kamchatka. Remember I showed you archaeological sites over here in northern Siberia. So the Bering Strait is dry land. Here's interior Alaska. And here's a possible scenario for events. So remember, we have this ancient northern Siberians and their new relatives, the East Asian population. They're maritime adapted. They're coming up the coast. They're moving along the southern coast of the Bering Land Bridge. We know from the human genetics that there was a group that the geneticists call ancient Beringians. They, we think, probably moved up the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers and then became extinct. So they're gone. There's no trace of them in any modern population. So in the meantime, the people we're interested in are the blue arrows. So these are the ancestral North Americans. And they're going to come down the Northwest Coast route. Well, what's the Northwest Coast route? To understand that, we've got to go back into the 1970s. So this guy, Knut Fladmark, is an archaeologist at Simon Fraser University. And his basic argument in the 1970s was, why walk when you can boat? Okay. And his further argument was that Canada 17,000 years ago looked like this. Basically, there were two continental ice sheets. And he continued that Canada today looks like this. But you could point out that there is a hay barn you can stay in. But the problem with the Northwest Coast route has always been the glacial geologists have always gone, all right, guys, but remember, there's 2,000 miles of an ice sheet margin. And it could actually have looked like this kind of nightmarish scene over here in Greenland, okay? How are you going to disperse along 2,000 miles of this? This seems like a huge, huge barrier. So Northwest Coast route, I don't know about this. So what has happened recently was, with Greg's constant critique, we put together the available glacial records. So this is, the little bars represent what is known about the age span of the last glacial maximum in all these different places. So here's the Alaska Range and Puget Lobe. So this is Olympia, Washington down here. So what you immediately see was it was not a single ice gate. Within the limits of our knowledge of the glacial chronology, there's a lot of noise, and it looks like things were not synchronous. It looks like the north deglaciated first, so the Alaska Range deglaciated about 20,000, and Puget Lobe retreated between 16 and 15,000. So in other words, instead of one monolithic gate, like it's open, come south, there was a whole diversity of gates opening and shutting. All right, so Greg was really excited about this, because he immediately pointed out, well, gee, we know from Glacier Bay, so Lisa Etherington, this is partly based on your work, deglaciation can jumpstart primary productivity, okay? Because this is your classic fjord circulation. So we have this brackish water on the surface, and it's creating this rotational circulation where we're drawing in oxygen and nutrient-rich deep water, okay? And if we have a big tidal flux, so think Setaka de Narrows, we get this upwelling and we get peak productivity. So we get all these great organisms, all this good human food. So we also know that, Sandy, you see what it says? It says, for unlawful flight to avoid confinement. We know from Sandy and his colleagues' work that salmon can very quickly reestablish their runs, okay? So we don't have to wait 1,000 years. Within decades, we can have a highly productive salmon run happening. And the bottom line, though, is, and this kind of goes back to Fladmark's point, is the calories are on the coast. You all know this, especially if you've ever lived in Fairbanks, Alaska. This place is like the breadbasket of the world compared to and that's a food desert up there. And some things probably were here that are no longer, were here that are not here today, including the stellar sea cow, okay, which would have been the ultimate catch if it was around. And the even more basic point is, and I think this is one of my gripes with archaeologists, is that we chronically underestimate the adaptability of people. the kind of innate cleverness of people. So people are adaptable, and I put this on here. This is the Tlingit place name map, which is on the back wall. I put this on here to emphasize that the Tlingit were here, the glacier came out, the Tlingit moved out, and they did just fine. I mean, it's not like environmental catastrophe cannot be surmounted by human ingenuity. So that's kind of the bottom point. So Greg's, this is him like pounding his fist on the table. Stop thinking of the retreating ice sheet as a barrier. Instead, it was an avenue headed south. So, thank you.